there. Once again, I want to thank Jubin Quresh-Afshar and Christopher Harjadi, excuse me, Christopher, for their participation as co-hosts. Mei Li, welcome to Foothill College.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you to all the students for inviting me to your campus virtually and into your classroom.
All right, fantastic. I wanted to begin, since we have many students in the room, and of course at a community college we have students from 16 to 66 and up, but since many of the students in the room are going to be of traditional college age, I kind of wanted to ask you how you first began as a writer and a journalist, and what that path was like for you as a teenager and young adult.
Okay, great. So I always, like reading. I always liked to read, and I always liked to write, but I didn't really know like how one does any of these things. But I started with writing for my town newspaper. I grew up in a very small town. I was born in California, but we moved around a lot, and I ended up between the ages of 12 to 18 in a very small town in South Dakota. And this was in the 1980s, and it was in some ways very similar to our current moment, in that there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment. People would drive by and they would shoot at our house. 5 of our dogs were shot dead, and over the years, and we would find them when we came home from school. We just were constantly being attacked. My brother was, beaten and had to go to the hospital. It was just nonstop. It was nonstop. So one of the things I wanted to do, I thought I wanted to join the media so I could start telling the stories that I felt were not being told and kind of stop the dehumanization. So when I was 15, I started writing for our town newspaper. And I would do these little features, and I would just interview people, and I would write up a little feature about them. And this was also kind of my breaking point because I interviewed a Cambodian family who moved to our town, and they opened our town's first Chinese restaurant. And since this was the early 1980s, they actually, they had just arrived in the United States, and they were survivors of the Khmer Rouge. And some of you may know the Khmer Rouge were this communist, basically insane fringe group that took over the entire country of Cambodia in 1975. Cambodia had been bombed secretly and illegally by the United States during the so-called Vietnam War, which led to destabilization of the entire country. And so when the US pulled out, the Khmer Rouge, the communists, took over, and they sent everybody into work camps. They took over all the cities. They started killing all the educated people. And so it took 4 years for them to be deposed. And so starting in the 80s, some refugees from Cambodia were allowed to come to the United States. So these survivors of the Khmer Rouge, they come to the United States, and they come to our small town, and they've been working in Texas, and they've been saving up their money, and they decided to open up our town's first Chinese restaurant. And it was so good. And, we had moved from first California, then the East Coast, to this tiny town. And so my father was so happy that there's a Chinese restaurant. We've been trying to drive all over South Dakota. We would drive 130 miles trying to find Chinese food. And so now we have this Chinese restaurant in our town, and we're so happy. So I interviewed the mother, and I was going to write about her in the town newspaper. And she said the only thing she wanted people to know was how her children had died. She'd had 3 Cambodian-born children, and they had died, under the Khmer Rouge. And the first child was a girl who was 8, had died. She had dehydrated. She had gotten sick, and there was no doctors anymore because they killed all the doctors. And so she died. So then the mother tried to flee in the night with a group of people. And the only way to get out was secretly, otherwise the government would try to stop you and kill you, just trying to leave. So she had 2 children left, a 5-year-old boy and like a 2-year-old child. And she was carrying the 2-year-old, strapped onto her body, and the 5-year-old she had walking behind her. And if you know anything about this era, the government put landmines They put these mines all over the land so people couldn't escape. And also so soldiers couldn't come in. And so everyone, when you tried to leave, you had to walk very slowly in a single file line, one footstep at a time. And then the person behind you would walk in your footsteps, and the person behind them would walk in their footsteps. It took a very long time, but that was the only safe way to make sure you didn't step on a mine. So she, they had the leader, and then they had the next person, and there was her carrying the one child with her 5-year-old behind her. And the 5-year-old, because he's just a kid, couldn't keep following in the footsteps, stepped off the path and set off a landmine. And he was decapitated and killed. So she made it all the way, even with her, after that, she still made it because she still had one baby left. Her husband had been sent away before this. So she kept going, even though she was, heartbroken. And she made it to a refugee camp, walked all the way to Thailand, only to discover that her baby, who had had this horrible fever, died. So she wanted me to tell this story. So this is the only story she wants the world to know. So I wrote it up, and I wrote this story for our small town newspaper, just saying, how this new business owner, they came to America, and this was what happened to her children. And then because I was 15, I had my mother proofread it because, I wanted to make sure my grammar was right, everything was correct before I turned it into the editor. And my mother said, "You can't turn this in. You cannot turn this into the paper." And I said, I was like, "Why? I promised, why not?" And she said, "No, do not draw attention to them. Do not draw attention to this woman." And then my mother revealed to me that the family had been receiving threats, and that someone had been sending them anonymous threats and saying, "Get out, you gooks, you chinks, you immigrants, you're taking our jobs." I mean, no, she's not taking anybody's job. They run their own restaurant. And someone had threatened to firebomb to their restaurant, use gas bomb it. And so they were so terrified that my mother said, don't draw any attention to them. So I didn't know what to do. And so I didn't turn it into the newspaper because I don't want to cause them problems. But I also felt so sad because I'd promised to tell this story. So I resigned from the newspaper because I thought, if I can't tell the stories that are important to me, I don't want to be part of this. At the same time, I felt this tremendous guilt. So ultimately what happened is the family had to sell their restaurant. They sold it at a loss and they fled. And they just got the hell out of our town and they went back to Texas. And I don't know what happened to them. But I carried that kind of broken promise with me, all throughout high school. And then when I went to college, I formed a mentoring group there was a lot of Southeast Asian refugees in those days who were being relocated to the Midwest. And Iowa, where I went to school, was a designated refugee relocation state. And so they were sent, at that point, 7,000 Southeast Asian families to the state of Iowa and to live. And so I said, I felt still haunted by what had happened in South Dakota. So we formed this mentoring group in college, and we all, there were like only 42 Asian American students in my entire college in those days. But we found each other by looking in a phone book and looked at each other's last names. We figured we've got to be Asian. So we'd call each other up. We formed this group. And then we volunteered in the local elementary schools. And we're trying to, act as mentors to the kids because we knew how rough it is to be Asian in these small little towns in the Midwest in those days. And then when I graduated, I continued, working for the school paper, and I got a job with the Associated Press, and I became a full-time reporter. And so then wherever I was stationed, I made sure to cover, the Southeast Asian community, because I felt like the one way you show people that you are welcome and you are part of our community, and we value you as a part of the community, is you cover the news, right? And I felt like, so this is my point. I felt like I hadn't been able to tell that story when I was growing up, so I'm going to do it now. And I kept, I would just cover the news of the community in addition to whatever stories I was assigned. But still, it was somewhat unsatisfying, I discovered, being a reporter. The Associated Press is a huge, what they call wire service. And it has many members. It's one of the largest news organizations in the entire world. And they have outlets in almost every country in the world, and you could be assigned, you know, to work overseas. And they have bureaus in every major city in the United States. So it's a huge organization, but we cover spot news. And spot news is basically like a breaking news story. So I covered plane crashes, crime, you know, weather. Whenever there's like a hailstorm or a tornado or a blizzard, then, you know, I have to like write up a, you know, a short piece about it. So you're very busy, but we only had one day a month when we're allowed to work on a feature story. And feature stories are kind of more human interest. It's not breaking news. It's not a crime or a disaster. It's like the kind of story that I liked, where you get to interview people, you get to do some research. And they're also very short. Most AP news stories are between 500 to 750 words. And sometimes like in one shift, I wrote 22 of them. You have to type very fast and you're constantly working. And so you're working like 22 of these a day, short little crime pieces, but it's very unsatisfying for me. And I wanted to write longer narratives, because I felt like there were stories that I couldn't tell when I'm only covering like a spot news event or crime, and I only get one longer story per month. And so that's when I decided to kind of leave journalism, and I went back to school and I studied a different type of writing. And I started writing like short stories. And I started, my first book actually was a novel, and it was set in China. And it was based in part by, I had gone to school when I was in college for a while in China. And so I wanted to kind of fight against these stereotypes again of Asians in America, you know. And so I wrote this novel, and then I wrote another book, and I wrote some family stories. And then finally, in this century, it took me a long time. Scott's waving his fist too. He knows this story. It was back in 2006. Do you remember Lou Dobbs? He's still out there. But Lou Dobbs, in 2006, on CNN, he had this show called Moneyline. He's supposed to talk about stocks, but he stopped talking about stocks, and he started immigrant bashing. And I'm like, oh my God, it's happening all over again, right? And, you know, and he started saying that Mexicans were spreading leprosy in America. And I just thought, this is insane. But no one would stop him. Like, CNN gave him this platform, and he kept saying, you know, immigrants are taking over a country and Mexicans are spreading leprosy. And this is clearly insane. So various human rights groups were trying to get CNN to stop him. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a huge civil rights group that keeps track of hate crimes that came out of the civil rights era of the 60s, they actually took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, and they showed the rates of leprosy in America. And they said, leprosy is not going up. There's very few cases. One, it's not going up. And two, there are no cases of Mexicans with leprosy, right? I mean, this is not where it's coming from. This is crazy. But so I was living in Wyoming at that time. My father was, my mother had died of cancer earlier, and so my father was ill. He'd had a heart attack, and then he had injured himself. So I was taking care of him and working part-time as an adjunct lecturer at the University of Wyoming. And my father's student, Matthew Shepard, had been murdered. So we were kind of in a depressive state. And so I thought, I must speak truth to power. I must tell a story. I must contradict Lou Dobbs. And so I decided to write the story of the Cambodian woman who I had interviewed all those years ago. I said, now is the time. I must speak up. And so I wrote this novel called Dragon Chica. And I chose the title Dragon Chica because it represents kind of like Asian culture, because this was a Chinese Cambodian family. And Chica because it's America, right? And Spanish is a part of America. And it's all in English. So it's English, and it's got the Asian, it's got the Spanish in there, references, and it's Dragon Chica, and it's about this family who survives the Khmer Rouge, and they come to America, and they start this Chinese restaurant. And I put the story of how the Cambodian woman's children had died, because that was the promise I had made, that I would tell that story. And so I put that in the middle, but then I realized that's not enough. The story that I can tell, because it's not, you know, I didn't experience that, is I can bear witness to how hard they worked and how they rebuilt their life in America. And so Dragon Chica, the novel, became not just the story of the children who died, but it's of the family and the children who were born in America and how they survive and continue to live in the US. And so that's the story Scott wanted me to tell you, because think about it. This is, some of you may have family stories like this, or we're kind of living in another moment like this, where a lot of anti-immigrant, there's a lot of hate speech, coming from our government and in the media. And so think about the stories that you just know yourselves from your friends, from your classmates, from your family, and start writing them down. And you can, collect this, and so that you can tell these stories and speak truth to power, so that these larger forces don't tell lies about us and our communities. So that's my long introduction.
But powerful. And I just want to add, as someone who is a great fan of Meili Chai's writing, and also just as a friend who is inspired by her on a personal and professional level, that story says so much about who she is. And those of you in my class who have read the required readings know that these themes come up over and over again in her writing. Telling the story that can't be told otherwise, speaking out the truth for the voiceless, using the power of story to push back against hate speech and racism, the courage that takes, the kind of marvelous blend of cultures and languages and perspectives, and the encouragement to others that is embodied in every single one of the pieces of writing that I've ever read by you. I wanted to wave, by the way, because I forgot in the intro, I can't get into my office to get your other books, but this was the one that was at home. And Useful Phrases for Immigrants, which is Meili Chai's most recent and a completely wonderful book. My students were asked to read the body from this book. That's the title of that short story. But I just wanted to put out a shout for that book, and then just also say, as I already did, that Dragon Chica and Tiger Girl were such a hit in my classroom. In addition to the issues that we mentioned, they also cover issues for teens, such as self-abuse, such as familial and sexual abuse, such as self-harm and suicide, and silencing and oppression, and finding your voice. So maybe I'll just stop with that as the sort of label of finding your voice, and finding your voice for other people also. I so much admire that about you, Meili.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Yeah.
And actually, I'll just say the reason why there was a sequel, Tiger Girl, is because I read Dragon Chica at Foothill, and his students were so enthusiastic. Students kept saying, "What's going to happen next? We want a sequel. We want more. We want more." So I told my
that's right.
And my publisher then asked me to write a sequel, and that is because of the students at Foothill College. So thank you.
I forgot that part of the story. I love that part of the story. Talk about students having a voice. So maybe when you get to ask questions, you can ask Meili if she will write something else that you desperately want her to write about, because it's happened. Like lightning could strike twice at the same college. And I didn't mention that Meili Chai came down to Foothill College on numerous occasions for Dragon Chica, and again more recently for another event that we did 2 falls ago, pushing back the anti-racism teach-in that we did. So she has been a frequent guest before at Foothill College, and it's kind of fun to welcome you back in the current virtual Foothill College in which we all live. I think maybe my next question that I want to ask you, Meili, was we're both interested in historical context, which is not something that all students are automatically interested in, but that's part of my writing. I'll just preface this by saying that when I was writing Tahoe Beneath the Surface, which I've been privileged to share with some of Meili's creative writing classes, I was writing about the history of Lake Tahoe, and I was literally shocked. And this is coming from a person who's supposed to have a PhD in American thought and literature and know my stuff. I had no idea until I read that book, or at least not a deep enough idea, of the historical extent of anti-Asian racism here in California and across the United States. I didn't realize also that Tahoe was an epicenter, that Lake Tahoe was originally named Lake Bigler because Bigler was the second the second elected governor of the state of California, and he ran specifically on an anti-Asian, pro-slavery platform. That's how he won. And thank God we renamed the lake Lake Tahoe, and it was for very political reasons. It was pushed back by Union supporters during the Civil War. I didn't realize that the Tahoe method was the label that was given to pushing out, burning out, raping, and often murdering people in Chinatowns across the United States, which is why I had seen so few existing Chinatowns. They'd all been burned to the ground. And this was in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. So we have more than a century of history about this. Anyway, that was a long intro, but I did want to say that.
And I have taught Tahoe Beneath the Surface to my classes, and it's always a revelation. This history is still not being told. I mean, I didn't know that the first victims of the Donner Party were the Native Americans sent to rescue them. It's like, whoa. I mean, I didn't even know that there was a rescue party that found them, but then the Donners murdered and ate, which is just amazing to me. And it feels like that should be California history that we know about. And yet we name the pass after them, right? We commemorate, we name this beautiful mountainside Donner Pass. So interesting what we choose to commemorate officially.
Yes, and I think in my book, there wasn't a single monument to the Chinese railroad workers until very recently. The only one that I ever found, I found wandering around randomly in a park in Shanghai, and there was a giant pyramid, a beautiful monument actually made out of railroad spikes. And that was, until quite recently, the only monument to the Chinese railroad workers who built the railroad and built Leland Stanford's fortune, and so on and so forth. But maybe what I'd like to ask you, I was actually asking you how history plays a role in your writing. Thank you very much for talking about how it plays a role in my writing. But I have been equally, well, much more actually astounded by what I've learned reading your books, because I since I wrote this book, I thought, well, now I know most of this. And no, I still am constantly stumbling across things in your writing that everyone should know, but no one has been told.
Well, thank you. I put together a little PowerPoint. I'm not good enough at Zoom to be able to show it. Maybe, would this be a good time? Does your co-host Chris, do you want to put up the PowerPoint slides? I can show you kind of the kind of history that I'm kind of working with and fighting against simultaneously.
Okay. Chris is going to work on that for us. And then
I'll just show. So for example, like the second book I wrote, I'll hold it up. This is a book that I wrote with my father. It's called The Girl from Purple Mountain. And this is a family story. And again, this is something you as students, you can be working on right now, putting down those family stories, writing them, before you think you'll never forget. But it's really interesting to remember how they're first told to you. Can I click on this?
Oops, sorry, that's the wrong screen. I was trying to share your PowerPoint, and I have to get rid of mine first.
Well, that was mine, but it needs to be clicked on.
It's wrong one. We need the Purple Mountain one, which is Mei Chai's. That's the other one that we sent over. So hold on just a second, Mei. We'll work. You can keep talking, actually, Mei. We'll get this done.
So this is the book that I wrote with my father after, we had a number of horrible things happen. We finally managed to get out of South Dakota and get to a safer place where people were not shooting at us anymore. But then, there's a lot of stress on the body. So my mother ended up getting cancer and dying. And then the very next year, my father had to have open heart surgery. And then his student, who was teaching at the University of Wyoming, Matthew Shepard, was kind of kidnapped, and you may know the story, and tied to a fence and beaten into a coma because he was gay. And so then I had to fly from California to Wyoming to take care of my father, and he was kind of suicidal. And he was talking about, it's time, we can stay there. It's time to go. It's time for me to go see Ma. And he'd point to the sky and he meant go to heaven. I'm like, no, it is not time, because I told him we're going to write your memoirs. And so we kind of worked on this project together, and it's about how my father's family survived World War II in China, and kind of how my grandmother was the key to their survival. And the whole family always credited her with, being so smart and keeping one step ahead of the invading, Japanese army, and keeping them alive and protecting them. But, in America, that's not the image of Chinese women. The image of Chinese immigrant women is that they're they're oppressed, and that they're either very weak, and they're, very weak, oppressed people who have no voice, or else they're like these wicked dragon ladies. And that comes from American movies. So I wanted to show you some images that I'd grown up with of supposedly Chinese women. And these are the only images that we ever saw when I was growing up of Chinese women. And most of them aren't even Chinese, but I'll show you some of these historical images. So if you go to the next slide, Chris.
Oh, it's actually me.
Okay, Scott. So
yes.
Here's Louise Rayner. She is not Chinese. She is German or Swedish, and she played the most famous Chinese woman in American literature. She played Olan from The Good Earth, the author, Pearl Buck, had been a missionary in China, and she won the Nobel Prize after she wrote The Good Earth, which was about Chinese peasants in the 1930s. And then the movie was made by Hollywood called The Good Earth, and it starred white people in yellowface. And so Louise Rayner got the Oscar for playing Olan. And there she is, and she doesn't really look Chinese. And she was in the whole movie, she kind of plays very oppressed. And she's always like, she can't assert herself, and she acts really kind of horrifically stupid. And it's just a total embarrassment. But this shaped the idea of Chinese women for generations in America. Okay, so Scott, if you show the next one.
All righty.
And there she is, right? She goes through the whole movie with this look of kind of just abject horror and kind of stupidity, her mouth hanging open. And there she is, the oppressed Chinese woman. I'll let you go to the next one. And then the other contrast, you've got the oppressed, subservient Chinese woman, and then you've got the dragon lady, sexy Chinese woman, who is a hooker. They're always hookers. These are the two images. And so this is another famous movie from the 1950s. And it's The World of Suzy Wong. And Suzy Wong, played by Nancy Kwan, is a prostitute in Hong Kong, but she's saved by an American. I don't even know why he's in Hong Kong. But he falls in love with her and saves her from the horrible world of Hong Kong. And that is The World of Suzy Wong. And we still kind of see these images replayed a lot in Hollywood movies. So I'll let Scott go to the next one.
All right.
But in real life, so I put some real life photos. This was my grandmother's family, right? They're not dressed in this weird sexual manner. They have families and they took pictures together. I've chopped off one of my uncle's heads there, unfortunately. But this was my grandmother in the center, you can see. And then that was her mother in the front, and her father. And those are her two brothers. Okay, we can go to the next one. I'll go through them fairly quickly since just kind of the visual. And so this was my grandmother. She's the second to the right. It was her PE teacher, is in the middle of her little scarf on. And my grandmother was one of the first 8 women to attend university in China. And so we see that there were Chinese women going to school. Like they're not all, oppressed or hookers. Go to the next one, please. And this was my grandmother, it's a wedding photo. We can go through these fairly quickly. So you can see she actually got married in America as a student. This was her back in Nanjing.
Another one. Okay.
yeah, keep going. And then came to the United States as a graduate student, went to school in Ohio. This is her with other international students back in the day. And then they returned to China actually in 1932, so that my father would be born in China. And that's my grandfather, my grandmother, my father, and his number two, his second brother.
Since I know your father, it's fun for me to see that photograph.
Yeah, he's still
his
kind
father
of
is also a professor, I might add. So.
And then my grandmother, as an educated woman, she founded a school, and she became a principal of an elementary school. And she used her education to create like kind of Chinese and Western school techniques. So she got, what American style playgrounds. And she also had coeducational schools, which were very unusual back in the 1930s. But it shows that there were women in China who were doing things besides, being just starvation or sex work. And then keep going forward. Think about, collecting your own family photos also, and digitize them, save them, try to keep your captions if your grandparents are still alive, while your parents still remember. And again, write these stories, because if I hadn't had these photos, I couldn't have written The Girl from Purple Mountain. And then this is, in 1937, the Japanese invaded Nanjing in what was known as the Rape of Nanking. If you read in Li Ji Lane, that essay, that's about how my grandmother and my father's family became refugees in their own country. And so then they had to leave Nanjing and they moved inland to try to escape the invading army. And so now we see them, they're in a village, they're looking tired and poor. And I circled the face of my grandmother and my father in the very front row, and then his brothers in the middle. And just to kind of record the passage of time. And I use this to put together the family narrative. And Chinese photos of this era are very small. They're like contact sheets, which was from film. And so they're like little 1 by 2 inch squares. So in order to get this photo, I had to take another photo of it and really blow it up so that I could see their faces.
Yeah, and let me interject, Mei Li. As you know, as a creative writing professor, I can name, half a dozen books off the top of my head that begin with a family photograph. And it is a fantastic writing prompt for students. So give this a try sometime. Get out a photograph that means a great deal to you, and especially a photograph that you see differently now as an adult than you did as a child, just as the photograph in Lilacs, which my students read, is something that you revisit as an adult. It's a very powerful technique. I just finished reading A Native Country of the Heart by Cherry Moraga, which is a new memoir by another beloved author, and that memoir begins with a photograph of her mother, and that remains the theme all through. My mentor at Stanford University, the late, great Arturo Islas, his breakthrough Chicano novel, The Rain God, began with a family photograph. So again, this is a technique that's really worth noting and giving a try in your own life. It can be tremendously powerful. It's like a time machine, I think.
I love what you said about revisiting, because I don't know if you've read Jamaica Kincaid's essay, Biography of a Dress. And
Yes.
she's writing about a portrait that was taken of her when she was 2 years old in this bright yellow dress. And then she goes back into it and talks about kind of all the trauma, of her mother saving the money to buy that fabric and the fabric being imported, and talks about colonization and why the imported fabric from England is more important than the domestic clothing that they already had to the mother, because that was the values of the ruling class. And so while the mother's was a beautiful photograph, for the child, it was a very painful experience. And Jamaica Kincaid writes about that kind of in 2 threads, the mother's intention and the child's pain. And it all comes centered around that photograph.
Yes, and in Lilacs, the photo of you, for those of you that haven't read it, I know my students have, Mei Li is describing an early photo of her where her mother essentially forces her to take off your glasses so that you will quote unquote look pretty. And since a theme in my teaching, by the way, Meili, is looking at the world through different lenses, it was actually the perfect choice for my class. But again, shows that when you look back now, you see this painful, I mean, you felt it in the moment, but it's something very intense for you to look back upon as an adult now.
I saw there was a question on chat. Should I answer that about it's they mentioned about
sure, that's fine. You know, it's great that you're monitoring chat, because I'm not. I was leaving that up to Chris and Jubin, but yes, please do.
Specifically kind of about the girl from Purple Mountain and the essay in Liji Lane. It says, did you empathize with your grandmother's decision to not take her niece with her to the United States? Do you think she could have been more assertive? And I mean, I think I wrote the essay because this was something that haunted my grandmother. You know, as you can see, like they had a stable middle-class life. Then, you know, the Japanese army invaded and they became refugees, and they had to keep moving and moving and moving for 12 years. There's no peace. It just kept going, you know. And then at the end of the Civil War in 1949, her brother wanted her to take the niece, right? And so he was afraid what would happen to a girl, and she couldn't do it. And she had to turn it down. And so as a kid, I'd never met this niece. I didn't know what she was talking about. She would just say, I couldn't bring her, you know. And so clearly it haunted her. It haunted her until her death. And she was never reunited with the niece. My father and I got to see, you know, his cousin after my grandmother died. And the cousin completely forgave her and understood, because this was, you know, her beloved aunt who had paid for her to have piano lessons and who treated her just like as equal as a son, and had, you know, wanted her to be educated, which was very rare, you know, in those days. And so this is the happy memories that sustained her during the horrors of like the Cultural Revolution and all the political upheavals. And I wish my grandmother had known that, but we couldn't get mail. You know, US did not recognize China from 1949 to 1979. So it was illegal to have direct mail. And so my grandmother couldn't even receive letters from her niece. If she had known that her niece was okay, and that her niece, you know, it wasn't about forgiving her, but just had happy memories, such happy memories of her. I think my grandmother would have been, a very different person, because she was so haunted by this. She could never really enjoy life in America. So in terms of my empathy, I mean, I can understand now as an adult, older than my grandmother was when she had to make that decision, how hard it would be. And she made the decision that she thought was the only decision she could make to save her own children. And she didn't know how hard it would be. And how, I mean, who can take an extra child, right? When you're fleeing a war, it's hard.
Well, and for those who haven't read the story too, which may include some of the audience, she was also worried that by bringing a young woman along, a girl, that she was both asking for the girl to be raped or attacked when she arrived in Taiwan, right? I mean, so that was part of the threat also.
She was afraid, like she didn't know, like her.
She didn't know, but she was afraid for her family. That this was like carrying a lightning rod with you, not only for the safety of the girl, but also for the safety of the rest of her children, right?
In World War II, rape was a tool of war. It was a deliberate tool of war. And so the opposing armies would rape women and girls, and they would kidnap girls and turn them into sex slaves in military brothels. And, you know, when they were fleeing the mainland to go to Taiwan, my grandmother didn't know what Taiwan would be like. You know, she didn't know, because it was Chiang Kai-shek soldiers, but Chiang Kai-shek soldiers were also very scary and dangerous. So she didn't know. And so she thought, you know, she takes the girl with her away from the girl's family, it's not necessarily safer, you know, and you have a adolescent girl who is very pretty, it attracts attention of soldiers. It might actually be even worse. So, and I think my grandmother made the right decision. I mean, I couldn't have known that at the time, and she couldn't know it. Had she brought the niece with her to Taiwan, one, it would have attracted attention. Two, the niece was older. It would be she had no way to get her into college. college was, and admissions were very regulated in Taiwan. And so she might not have been able to pass the entrance exam because she hadn't been going to school because of the war. And so at her age, she would have had to take that exam when she arrived. If she didn't pass, she wouldn't get in. So she would have no future, right? And then also it was very hard for them to get to the United States. They went to Taiwan, and only my father, he was sent first as a 17-year-old, as a parachute child. He was sent to the United States. She was able to get him a scholarship to a small college in upstate New York. He went by himself as a boy. And then she said, you've got to get visas for the rest of the family. And that's a tremendous amount of pressure. But within 5 years, by the time he graduated, he did find a sponsor, and he was able to get visas for his family. But the niece would have been over 21 because she was older. And under US immigration policy back in those days, the niece would not have been allowed to immigrate with the family because she would have been considered an adult. His younger brothers just made it underneath and were still considered minors and made it to the United States. But the niece was older than my father. She would have been in her mid-20s. She would not have been given a visa by the United States government to come with the family. So it would have been much harder if my grandmother had taken the niece to Taiwan. One, she would not necessarily have any means to protect her. The niece would not necessarily have been able to get any education. And three, she would not have been allowed to come to the United States. So it'd be another heart-wrenching situation. Do they not immigrate to the United States, or do they leave the niece behind with no family in Taiwan? Do they try to arrange a marriage for her? So I think my grandmother ultimately made the right decision. The niece survived. She got an education. She became a chemist. And in fact, in the 1980s, she was able to emigrate to the United States with her husband, and for a while worked at Columbia University. So it worked out, but my grandmother didn't know that. And that was the wrenching part.
Right, and in Dragon Chica and Tiger Girl, the Cambodian woman's story that you told through fiction eventually also leaves her children. Well, her children are killed. They're left behind, and it drives her insane, quite literally. So again, these kind of those left behind are so often the girls and the women. And that's just a fact of war and history. Shall we keep going with the slides?
Sure. And there's also one question about this. Someone had asked about, with rape being a weapon of war, how do you think this horrific reality played into the stereotype of, oops, it kind of disappeared, of Asian women being hookers, i.e. World of Suzy Wong? Actually, there's a direct correlation. Because so many Asian women were kidnapped, and girls even were kidnapped and forced to work into military brothels. The United States military did not see them as being women who had been kidnapped and forced to work as sex slaves. They saw them just as sex workers, as hookers. And the US military also made use of these brothels. And so the image in America of Asian women, and this goes from China to Japan to the portrayal of Vietnamese women from the Vietnam War era, are always as sex workers, and not seeing it as women being forced into this work because of soldiers and threat of starvation or literally kidnappings, but seeing it as like some type of choice. Oh yeah, Asian women just like this. I'm like, and we don't question that. The white privileged men who got to be, the directors, like Oliver Stone, and these other directors, they didn't question why these women were in this line of being used in this way. They just thought, oh yeah, that's what they do. And so there is actually a direct correlation between these images of Asian women as sex workers in Hollywood movies and rape being used as a tool of war.
Yes, and thank you for the question. We'll get to more of those. Thank you so much, Mei Li, for multitasking that way. I have difficulty with that. That's why I assigned it to my TAs.
Um, I'm paying attention. And I only have, my brain doesn't multitask as well as yours does. But I wanted to follow up with two observations to what you're saying. The first is that to this day, and I'm sad to say this, I have many, many friends in the military and veteran students who I completely admire, including close friends. But to this day, American military bases are surrounded by either explicit or hidden brothels. And so the American military is in no way immune to this phenomenon at all, or to the prevalence of rape around military bases. And I'm sad to say that. I'm proud to be an American, but I'm not proud of that part of our military history, and I think we can and should do better. The other thing I wanted to mention, because we were going through the film history of stereotypes, that, as you know, Wayne Wang, who was the first really important Asian American director, a breakthrough director, was a Foothill graduate. Oh, you didn't know? Ha ha!
Yeah. From Chan is Missing all the way into he did
Dim Sum.
He did Made in America. He did was it The Princess of Nebraska from
Joy Luck Club. Joy Luck Club. Many 2 decades before Crazy Rich Asians, right? Like,
I like it better than Crazy Rich Asians. I mean, Crazy Rich
I
love John Hughes. More power to him. You know, we need big Hollywood productions and rom-coms, and that's great. But it's, you know, it's a very kind of super privileged perspective, right? You know, it's only looking at the super wealthy, and you know, it's very Hollywood. It's very Hollywood.
Yeah, and I'll put in your new creative writing student at San Francisco State, Edward Gunawan, who I think is on this call. Also, as an Indonesian filmmaker, shattered many of these stupid stereotypes as well. So we actually have two award-winning, beloved film directors, producers, screenwriters who came straight out of Foothill College and did internationally important work in shattering these hideous stereotypes and doing what you do also, which is to tell the stories that have not been told and to tell them with cultural sensitivity and heart and understanding. So I'm looking for more. Speaking to my students, we're looking for more. You're coming out of a dynasty. Let's get busy. Okay, back to you, Millie.
Okay. Slide. See what that is. I can't remember.
Okay, sure. Here we go.
Oh, okay. So then this is another image, and the reason why I wanted to put these photos in the book also is it's images of real family, right, as opposed to stereotypes. So this is again during the war. You can see everyone's wearing really baggy clothing. My grandfather has been basically the only job he can get is working for a warlord. So he was a law professor, and now he's in a military uniform. And this, I think in 42 must have been Hunan, just before they went to Chongqing, which was the wartime capital. And then my father's in the miniature soldier's uniform because that's what children were told to wear in those days.
That's right.
Okay, let's keep going. And then this is the air raid shelter. This was Zhou Enlai, who was the right-hand man to Mao Zedong, and he had a huge air raid shelter in Chongqing. And I was able to visit with my father for research for the book. The city of Chongqing also used to be known as Chongqing. And that's where the capital of China was moved from Nanjing to Chongqing during World War II. And 11,000 bombing raids were flown over the city of Chongqing. So everywhere in the city, they built these underground, this is a huge tunnel, but they had like, some tunnels were just small enough for one person to crouch in, and they were behind like a noodle stand. And on the campus of my father's elementary school, right, they would sound the air raid sirens, and all the children would take off running, and they would have to go to their little underground air raid shelter. The entire city has these air raid shelters. And now movies coming out of Sichuan province They've often been set in the air raid shelters because they still exist. It's so interesting. And that was one of the hallmarks of life in China during World War II, is you had to live in spend time in bombing raids. In Nanjing, I just recently returned a couple years ago. They invited me to speak at the university about my writing. And one of my former students, because I also had taught in Nanjing, said, oh yeah, when he was a kid in the 80s, the Nanjing air raid shelters had been turned into video arcades. And so I just think this is something that's interesting, is we don't think about how war disrupts a nation. And we don't think about how it disrupts childhood. And then there were so many bombing raids in China that for several generations of people unto the present, these bomb shelters are part of life. And even though they're not being bombed now, like in the 80s, they were video arcades, and like just a couple of years ago, they were opening them up and turning them into like underground shopping malls because they're cool from the heat. And so it doesn't make as much.
They're all variations on Plato's cave, I believe, but there we go. The virtual Plato's cave. Let's see, let me hit the next slide for you.
And then this was after World War II. As you can see, the children growing up. That's how I could do the timeline. One of the reasons I put this photo is that my father could not, like, his memories are a jumble. And so sometimes if you interviewing a parent or a grandparent, they may not remember exactly when something took place. It doesn't matter. Take down that memory, just write it down. And then you can use other ways to try to put those memories into a timeline. And one of the things that I could use is family photos. You might remember doing something in some place, and I could figure out which came first because the children kept getting bigger, right? So if they were taller, then it obviously happened later. And if they were shorter, it happened earlier. And so that was one of the visual ways I could put together the family timeline. So that's one of these photos.
Okay.
And then this is just before this is literally the boat that they took to go from Guangzhou, which is also known as Canton, in 1949 to Taiwan. And that's with my uncles, my grandfather and grandmother, but not the niece. She did not go on this trip. She was left behind.
So that moves perfectly with the reading that we did then. So that she's the invisible person in that photo, right? Like she's literally a ghost. We also read a ghost story called The Body. You can find it in the library links on the foothill.edu API Heritage Month page. Powerful story of a young woman found dead under mysterious circumstances, which haunts. But the ghost, it's like there's a ghost in that photograph, and you allow us to see the ghost, right? Like we can see her.
So, and then you see, my grandma does not look happy, right? She looks very sad. She looks very sad. Even though there's like the rescue, they're escaping, she doesn't look relieved. She looks very sad.
Professor Jamie has a question about your grandmother. Jamie, do you want to ask the question? And you could unblock your video and mic.
We'll see if Jamie's there. If not, you can read the question for her.
Car passing. But I asked some other questions, but not specifically about your grandmother. I had more questions about Liliac and how you identified as an Asian American and your relationship with your mom.
Okay, so that's the lilac story. I identify as Asian American because basically that's how I was raised. There's genetics, so I'm a mix of these different kinds of people, but we didn't have much to do with my mother's family when I was growing up because my grandfather on my mother's side was an alcoholic, and he was very violent, and he'd been very violent towards my grandmother and to my mother. So when I was growing up, my mother was afraid of her family, and so we didn't interact much with them. Meantime, we're very close with my father's family. So like when I was born in California where my parents met, and every summer, my Chinese grandparents who lived in New York City would come and spend the summer with us, and they would just live with us. And then when I was 6, we moved to be closer to them, and we saw them every single week. And not only we see them every single week, we go into Manhattan to eat with them, But during our school breaks, they would come. I don't know if everyone's family does this. For me, it was very normal. I don't know if this is normal for other people. I've never really even thought about it. They would come and live in our house. So during our school break, they would just come in the winter, and they would take over the family room, and they would just live with us. And I don't know if grandparents do that and just move around and live with their various sons and grandchildren, or daughters and grandchildren. That's interesting. So I was very close to the Chinese side, and we weren't as close to my mother's side because of that violence. And then when we moved to South Dakota, oh my God, when people are shooting at us and literally attacking our family, they're doing it because, they identify, like they didn't attack my mother, they attacked my father and my brother and me. And so my mother kept insisting, that, oh, well, you're not really Chinese. You're not Chinese. But it's like, well, we're being attacked like we are. You know what I mean? So I really have to understand this. My mother didn't want me to study Chinese. My mother did not want me to. I actually studied Chinese in college, and I went to China as a student, and I studied at Chinese University in Nanjing. I translated the book as Scott said. My mother didn't want me to learn Chinese. As she got older, she kind of internalized the racism that we suffered, and she never really had time to process it. And so it just made her very reactive and very fearful. And so she wanted me to side with her, but I kept trying to explain to her, I can't be white in America. It's not really a choice, right? People don't see me as white. People don't react to me as white. If I'm going around like, oh, there's been a lot of anti-Asian attacks because of COVID, and because our president of the United States is calling it the Chinese virus, and he's blaming it on China, as opposed to, like, viruses don't care what your race is. They're just looking for a nice human host, right? But because of this rhetoric, there's been a lot of people attacking Asian people just on the street. There was a Burmese family in Texas. They even slashed the children's throats. There was a woman taking out her trash in Brooklyn last week, and some guy went up and threw acid on her. I mean, there's been crazy attacks. And initially, some of the responses have been like, there was a Korean American newscaster at CNN, and she said, I'm not Chinese, I'm Korean. Okay, well, that's wonderful ethnically that you have pride in your Korean heritage, but it doesn't really matter if you're Korean or if you're Chinese, or how you identify. If people see you as this other, they're going to treat you as this other. So we have to attack that racist behavior. And just trying to put ourselves into the safe category doesn't stop the racism. In order to stop racism, we have to attack, we have to say and critique the impulse to be racist. It's not about just trying to put ourselves into a safe category. And my mother, she was born in the 1930s, which we didn't have that type of discussion. Racism was totally legal in America, right? Segregation was totally legal. It was part of the laws of America. So as I write in the essay Lilacs, as a little girl, she was beaten by her mother until she bled because she had talked as a social equal to a Black woman and had invited her over to the house for pie. And so my grandmother tried to instill that racial line by beating her own child. And this is like something that put fear in my mother, and she knew it was wrong, but she couldn't really articulate how to fight that. And part of the reason is that generation was not giving tools. Like, no one talked about it. It was considered bad to talk about race. It was considered racist to talk about racism. So she had no tools to fight this. And so one of the reasons why she didn't want me studying Chinese is, I think, is that she felt that was not safe. And I couldn't get her to understand that actually, it's something I love, and I should have a right to study this. And that heritage is important to me. It's not a rejection of her to express myself. And it also doesn't stop racism to pretend, oh, we're not Chinese. To pretend that doesn't help us. We have to say it's wrong to attack people because of their race. And so that was a sad thing between my mother and myself. One of the things.
I'm sorry. I found that it was a little bit of irony that your mom raised you to be very resistance and bold and just stand up for yourself. But at the same time, she struggled doing that as well. And I think she might have been a little traumatized by how blatant like racism was for her growing up. And I also wanted to know a little bit more about how you felt when she wouldn't speak up for your family and would kind of have like a bystander approach to racism and kind of just call it being like uneducated. And when you went to go educate yourself about your history, she was very like against that almost.
She was against it. Thank you. That's a great question. It was very painful. It was very painful. And I'm glad that if one good thing comes out of this horrible moment that we're going through with our evil president, who's just overtly racist and is trying to, hurt us, he really seems like he wants to kill us all at this point to make a profit. I'm scared, but I'm glad that we as a society are having this conversation. And, if we can get through this moment and wrest control back or just slightly more back, we can use the tools that we are learning now and push back and hopefully prevent this from happening again. I think the media for a long time, the mainstream media, I've been worried, I've been speaking up about Trump since 2016 when he was on the campaign trail and saying Mexicans are rapists and China's raping the US and you can grab women, blah, 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 right? I won't even repeat it, it's so crude. But clearly these were bad things. But we had the mainstream media from NPR to the New York Times to basically all the news organizations just repeating them, right? And they didn't have someone else saying, that's really disgusting and that's really racist. They just repeated what he said. And they allowed him to say also lies for many years. And they did. Now, they're like, it took to this moment of the pandemic to point out, there was the wonderful Yamiche, I think her name is Yamiche Alcindar. She's an African-American reporter for public television. And she, in a press conference, said, well, why do you call it the Chinese virus when scientists call it COVID and Asian American groups all over the country say they're being attacked because people are calling, thinking it's a Chinese virus when it's actually not, right? It's just a virus. Viruses don't have ethnicities. And Trump refused to answer the question. And he also refused to stop. But it took this moment for the media to push back. So what I'm hoping is, like, my mother didn't have these skills. She didn't know what to do. She totally retreated. It was overwhelming to her. She did, as you point out, there's a good insight. She carried a lot of trauma from her upbringing, her violent upbringing. And she didn't know what to say. And sometimes her trauma was so great, like she'd have panic attacks and she just couldn't respond, which made me very sad as a child. But it's made me into an adult who speaks up. And so maybe in this moment, we'll all be kind of learning societally that we need to speak up.
But I think in 2015 and 2016, many media and news organizations felt that Trump was going to be good for their bottom line. So they gave him a lot of free press and goaded him. And I think that we need to have a serious discussion about having news like the BBC format that we all pay into it every year, $20 a year, and we get unadvertised news that is not push-pulled to get certain groups to watch the news. And I think that's been the problem, is that our news is monetized in that way. And I think the best person that actually said this was this rocker, and I forgot his name, was in Michael Moore's movies, that the problem is the news is playing and gives you all these fears and all these hostilities, and then they give you 3-4 minutes that you need to buy Tide to feel warm and good, or that you need to drink this beer to be happy. So in a sense, the news is driven by that profit margin of advertisers. And so and I think you even now, if you watch any advertisement online or in video, and I don't know how fast they did this, but they're talking about all this COVID stuff and that, and it's just like, well, wait a minute, like how fast do they make these advertisements to push to us because people are glued in their homes and online. So if our news, certainly with 2016, showed that they were goading on Trump, and he was getting a lot of free media.
Oh, yeah.
Meili, if I can also add, partly for sharing blame equally, because there's more to go around. In a recent Facebook post, Meili was excoriating and scolding angrily, and I thought completely justifiably, the New York Times for its highly skewed coverage of the COVID crisis, almost entirely focusing on the East Coast, and completely leaving out our own dear state, which was the first to institute the stay-at-home controls and the quarantine. And we were the ones that have led the way in the United States in flattening the curve. And even when they've apologized, racism creeps into the New York Times coverage as well. So I am no fan of our current president, but I think, as Jobin points out, it's a larger problem with media coverage as a whole, which has blind spots around Asian American identity and really institutionalized racism in their coverage, including these kind of liberal icon media outlets such as the New York Times.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Jobin and Scott, those are really good points. And one, I feel like we need to be more intersectional, right, in our attack. We also have to really think about how capitalism functions in our society. As Jobin points out, there's money to be made by promoting racism, right? Because it sells papers, it gets attention on the news. If you present something as a conflict, more people will tune in. And sponsors like a lot of people tuning in. So there's that. And then, as Scott said, there's even the most liberal, so-called liberal bastions. They don't interrogate their own inherent bias. Like that article he was talking about, I was so angry about. They finally mentioned the West Coast. And they said, well, we've tended, the media is concentrated on the East Coast. And I'm like, no, you're writing from the New York Times. You're the one on the East Coast. There's media on the West Coast. What are you talking about? And then they said, and it's also a 3-hour time difference. I'm like, what? I mean, because it's a 3-hour time difference, you can ignore the most populous state in America? That's insane.
Well, New York Times is a paper of record, so they have a responsibility.
Yes.
It's not just like, so, I mean, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's absolute BS that there's a 3-hour difference. Like, really, like, but I think sensationalizing, you get more attention if you say 100 people died in New York than saying, 40 million in Californians are actually doing pretty well. And, oh, by the way, social distancing has worked in Northern California. That's why our death rates are so low.
But it's also important to add, Jobin, that Meili will explain this, and she explained it very well in her Facebook post. I mean, there was implicit or even explicit racism involved in this as well. It wasn't just New Yorkism, in other words, right? Like the famous New Yorker cover where the edge of the world is the East River and then the rest of us are tiny blips on the horizon, and that still goes on. Including in publishing, which is highly biased towards establishment writers and white writers in New York to this day. But also, Meili, can you say a few words, since it's API Heritage Month on this broadcast? I thought your points were very well made and really incisive in terms of how the New York Times apologized, because they didn't just say the 3-hour time difference, right? Which is a stupid reason. I agree, Jobin.
They also said, well, in there trying to explain how good the West Coast response has been, they said, well, it's also because they're Pacific states and they're closer to China and they have a lot of Asian immigrants. So they recognized that it was a
China problem.
They recognized, because China's closer, that it's likely to be a threat. The threats in China could also be threats in America. And I'm like, wait a minute. You're going back to the blaming China thing. It's a global pandemic. And especially they've traced the cause in New York, and it came from Europe.
Europe,
right?
yeah.
This person who spread the virus to New York City was coming from Europe. So blaming China is worthless at this point. We live in a globalized world. But they said, well, the West Coast, we're closer to China, so we recognize the threat sooner. I'm like, because we have a lot of Asian immigrants. We also have a lot of Asian Americans, right?
Mm.
Also, we are citizens represented by our leaders. And I said, we also recognize sooner that there were Asian countries handling the crisis, and we could use their best practices here. So it's not just Asia's a threat, but Asian
South
best.
Korea.
And Japan too.
And Taiwan.
Right? Japan, and even Wuhan. It started off horribly, but they shut it down. They made everyone wear masks. They did social distancing and shelter in place, right? And it stopped it. They were late, but they managed to stop it. And we could see that. And so look what we did. We were the first, San Francisco is the first city to do shelter in place. California is the first state to do shelter in place. Just as Japan and China and South Korea and Hong Kong and Taiwan also closed down their schools, had everyone, stay at home. We did that too. So it's not just that Asia is a threat. We can also learn positive things and positive techniques. But they will not, it's amazing to me, the New York Times still does not give any Asian nation credit for how they handled the COVID crisis. And I mean, we should be following the Taiwan model. They're so close. They're little tiny, right? They're a tiny island. It's like 25 miles off the coast of China. They have so many people going back and forth for business. And they have closed the crisis down, and they're not having very many deaths at all, or even infections. And that is something we can learn from. But we don't say that in the series.
Parsa has a question, and Parsa, why don't you go ahead and unblock your video and audio, and you could ask the question.
Oh, and Mei Li, let me interject just a quick moment here. Do you want me to unscreen share the slide, or shall we keep going?
We don't need to keep going. The conversation with students is good.
Okay, I'll stop share.
Parsa, do you want to ask the question, or?
Yeah. So we talked about a lot about racism through news and movies, the effect that we have in our community. How do you think an individual could cause the greatest change to racism that is occurring?
Okay, and you said in your chat, what are some other ways we can make a change? So, I mean, I think that this is something that it's good to hear from young people, because my generation, my tendency is to write books, tell these kind of mainstream media sources, but there's a lot of stuff going online, and I'm not as active in these forums. Whereas I know young people are really active online and really good at using not just like TikTok and social media and all these other spaces where this is happening. So I think this is where we should start listening to your generation. What would help? Really, what would help to get the word out in these other forums? How do we send positive messages in social media that are anti-racist? A lot like Zoom, we're all doing conferences and, using Zoom in our classrooms, but the people who made Zoom never thought of Zoom bombing, right? So they were very slow to respond to putting up security to prevent that. It didn't occur to them because, the CEO was in his 40s. He's not on these chat forums thinking about how he can Zoom bomb. So I think that a lot of this is where you as students, we want to hear your voices. And I think your ideas on this can be very, very helpful.
Yeah, and if I can interject, Mei Li, in my class, and anyone that's listening in that's not in my class is more than welcome to contribute. If you look, first of all, if you look on the main webpage for our API Heritage Month at foothill.edu, you'll see that we do have a COVID-19 messaging contest going on for social media. And I would love it if any of you would participate. And that's at the top of the API Heritage Month page, is to challenge students to get the message out, and messages about health and messages about anti-hate and inclusivity are welcome, and Foothill's making that happen. And then also my students have to write their first big essay, because this is a composition class. They have to write for an online magazine on medium.com, of which I am the editor, but they are required to write as journalists and commentators for an online magazine that students named The Global Citizen. So those are two ways in which I would, in one case, encourage, and in another case, require my own students to have a voice in this conversation in writing. And then I think it's time for the student question now. Sorry to
Saba has a question. Why don't you go ahead and ask it, and you can unmute your video and microphone.
Is that the same student that we had unmuting before? Because I kind of interrupted Jobin. I wasn't paying enough attention. Chris, was that, or Jobin, was that the same student?
Yeah, it was the same student.
Okay.
Hi, so the question is actually going back to a previous topic we were talking about. We kind of went ahead from it, but I was reading Lilacs and I felt like I really resonated with the message, not only as a woman, but also as someone whose definition of femininity like clashes with her own mother's, because like we come from different generations and that's just a given at this point. But I wrote that you mentioned the clash between your mother's desires for you to be a good white girl and your identity as an Asian American. And I'm asking, how did you come to reconcile the inherent need to do justice by your mother while also becoming your own woman?
Like, how do I reconcile, like, having a relationship with my mother? Is that what you're asking?
Because you mentioned at the end of Lilacs that you felt like your mother was quietly trying to instill resistance within you, but you also were wondering whether she was proud of you at the end for becoming your own person. And there was a conflict within the story about how you deal with being a good woman in your mother's eyes and being your own person.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a good question. It's very thoughtful. It's hard, you know, and I wished my mother had lived longer is the thing. She died, you know, she died at age 61 and when I was 28. So, and I took care of her for 2 years, but she was very ill. And so those 2 years were not like good years to have any communication about these issues, because it's really just basically trying to survive at a physical level. So that's why I'm kind of haunted by this. I don't know, you know, I'm very different from maybe what she in some ways wanted me to be. But then I also think that some of those notions were of who I should be and how I should be as a woman in America were related to her own trauma. And had she lived, and maybe had I got her into therapy, and we could have had a discussion about this, I think we could have got to a point maybe of some understanding. I hope so, right? But because she died and we never had that discussion, then I am haunted by that, because I don't really know, because we never made peace about it. And I think part of it is that period of time from, you know, your teens to your 20s, or when you really are trying to become yourself and you have to figure out who is the person I want to be. And so I couldn't have that discussion with my mother because I'm still in the process of being formed in those days. So I don't know. I think that you guys are going to have to do that hard work, and you can maybe shoot me an email later and tell me how it all works out.
I think it's the duality. And in the sense that as immigrants, our families and our parents have this idea that, oh, this is like the perfect American way. But ultimately, I think they just want their kids to have a better life than they did. And they may not know what that better life is. And so they have this idea, but in a sense, ultimately, if you kind of make it and you stand up for yourself and have all those things, I think in a way parents would be happy. I mean, if your mother, you know, she may have not thought that, you know, you being a professor and a journalist, maybe she never imagined that. Maybe she thought of something else, but ultimately you're happy and you're doing what you enjoy, and I think she would be proud of you. And I think it's personally as an immigrant, from that point.
I think that is, thank you, Jovan, that makes me feel better. I think what's hard is that often, just generationally, the path to our own survival, right, when you're a kid or when you're a teenager, is not clear, because it's so different from our parents' generations and their path to survival. And so they think that they're putting you on this path to survival, but you as a kid instinctively think that's going to kill me, right? That path is not a path to survival. That if I go on that path, I will be dead, either physically or emotionally. And I think it can be very hard to express that to our parents because they didn't experience that and they don't understand why you don't want to go on this path that they think is safe. But I think there is real danger, right? There is real danger for young people, as there was when I was growing up, and I think there is today. And if you don't find your path to survival, you might not survive. That's the hard part.
Yeah, and if I can quickly interject, two things. In your story, you quote Maxine Hong Kingston, one of the most beloved American authors out there, saying when our mothers say don't tell anyone this secret, what they really mean is tell. And that's a powerful, that's something I think really powerful. I love that you inserted that quote in there as someone who's taught Maxine Hong Kingston for decades now. And I also wanted to add, this is a little bit of an advertisement for our next event, which is coming up on Thursday. Actually, President Nguyen is coming up tomorrow at noon with the Anti-Racism Forum. You're welcome to join in with that, my students. It's not required, but highly recommended. And then Sandeep Roy is going to be joining us from Kolkata. And I'm mentioning Sandeep because some of his readings deal with a similar phenomenon for those of us, myself included, as a cisgendered gay male who prefers he, him pronouns, by the way. There's a famous book called The Best Little Boy in the World that many of us identify with because we grew up trying to be good boys, just like you were given this, like you have to be a good girl. So I think there's an intersectional piece of this that so many of us, no matter what our identities and our intersectional identities, face as you become an adult. Because at least in my opinion, as somebody who came out early, at least by my generation's standards, and was mentored by some of the first out professors in the United States, you have to stop being a good boy or a good girl at some point to be an adult. Like you can't be yourself and be this little good girl or good boy. And a lot of what I had is still there. But I think that comes through so powerfully in your fiction, in Dragon Chica, in Tiger Girl. I think it comes across so powerfully in your memoirs. I think it comes across so powerfully in your journalism. It's just a consistent theme, and I'm delighted that we're talking about it.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think the people who actually are remembered in society are not people who are just going to follow the current script. They kind of updating it and saying oh, there's parts of it that doesn't work. I think, for example, with your example of the Asian American non-coverage in the United States, and that kind of speaking out about it and saying, these are all these Asian Americans who are doing all these good things that aren't being recognized, is kind of another way to kind of turn the tide of this kind of racism in a way.
How lovely that we have a family picture behind you, Chris. I think you could write about that one. We have the child. I think, is that you?
Yeah, that's me actually.
Yeah. So we have literally the cute child Christopher, and then we have the adult Christopher here, the emerging adult. And Neely gets an award in Edgewise here somewhere, I think, since she's our guest of honor.
Well, I just noticed there's some questions on chat. So if I can respond to one of those. It says from Celine, can you speak to the role of vulnerability in your writing? The two pieces we read are personal anecdotes, and it sounds as though your writing journey started from a place of telling others' stories. How do you get to a place of openly and honestly sharing your experiences as you do today? And I think that's really insightful. when I first started writing, again, I started as a journalist, which is telling other people's story. You interview other people. You're not allowed, even in those days, now some subjectivity in some types of journalism. But when I started, no, the journalists are not allowed to put themselves into the story. And that was kind of my training. And that was the only, like, I never saw anyone like myself in any story I read. You know, in school, K through 12, I don't think we did not read a single Asian American author. We didn't even read Chinese and China stories. There were no Asian American stories. There was nothing. So I didn't have any role models for telling my story. Just a second, I have to let this door person in. Sorry. It was, so I didn't know how to tell my story. I did not know how to tell my own story. I had no way to tell my story. If I could just interview some people that I knew existed who I felt were being erased, then I felt like maybe that would give me a space in. And sorry about that interruption. And then as I got older, because I succeeded in telling these other stories, then I could put my story in. But when I first started, I didn't know how to do it. I didn't even feel like I had the right. I didn't know how to describe myself. And it was only through writing like all these other stories constantly that I could begin to see what was, like, how I fit into that spectrum.
Pavel has a question that kind of really dovetails with mine. Pavel's is, what do you think about the growing popularity of Asian movies with films like Parasite and Farewell? And do you feel like the situation is getting better? And mine was more about like Fresh Off the Boat and its portrayal of Asian and American life in the mass media.
Sorry, I am the guy who asked the question about the Parasite and Farewell. And I would also love to add to a question that right now there's a growing popularity of also Asian characters in different Netflix shows or television in general. And I was wondering about, because they show characters, it almost seems like the Asian characters exist there just for the diversity without really considering who the characters are and what they represent. So I'm wondering, what's your opinion on this? If there is just a need to increase the popularity of Asian characters, or is there really the need to sort of filter how and what they represent?
I think that's a great question, and that's a really nuanced reading of these different images, right? Like Parasite is a movie from South Korea, and in South Korea, those characters are the majority people. So they're not coming in as like Korean American stories. And there still isn't, we're not seeing mainstream acceptance of like Asian American or Korean American stories. It's still from Asians as people in Asia. I love, Parasite is great. It's a beautiful movie. I've been following Bong Joon-ho's career. I've loved his films for a while, and it won the Oscar, which was amazing, but it's not an Asian American story. And he gets money from his own country and his own government and his own film industry to make that movie, and there's a huge, and the Korean film, America is very late to this. The Korean wave, as they call it, has been hot all over the world since the 90s. And we're like 20 some years, we're 25 years behind that Korean wave. But South Korea has done a great job in promoting its film industry and nurturing its artists. In America, it's harder because Asian Americans don't have the support of an industry behind them. Like, I know Jeff Yang, who's the father of Hudson Yang, who starred in Fresh Off the Boat. And when that series first came on, like, it was so risky. It was so risky. They had so many difficulties. And so I was teaching out in North Carolina, and Jeff Yang formed this Asian American group, media group, and he asked us specifically, he says, if we don't make such and such Nielsen points, they're going to cancel us. We won't even make it to the end of the season. And so he said, every week, can you live tweet the show? And every week, can you, put it on Facebook? He says, I've got to prove to the network that people are watching, and the only groups he could reach out to were basically other Asian Americans. So even, it's not my favorite show. It's maybe, it's skewed younger. The jokes were a little you know, kind of crude. It's a sitcom, right? It is what it is. But every week that first year, I would watch it and I would live tweet it. And so we'd have people in every time zone live tweeting it, because we knew if we didn't get this, we would get nothing, right? That was it. We felt like we have to get the foot in the door, because it'd been 25 years since Margaret Cho had a series, which was also, it was awful. But, you know, 25 years is a long time to wait. It's like Joy Luck Club came out in 1993. It made over $100 million, which was huge for 1993, right? It was a super successful movie. And then nothing else until Crazy Rich Asians. It's a generation, a lost generation. So I also know people who were involved with, you know, Crazy Rich Asians. And I know people who were involved with The Farewell, and they reached out to every single like Asian American professor or writer, and they're asking us to help support. They asked us specifically, like when The Farewell come out, they said, we need a gold opening. You've got to go out the first weekend and you've got to tweet about it. We've got to get the word out, because if we don't make it the first weekend, it dies and we will be pulled from theaters. And so part of it is, in order to make these shows successful, is every single person, you know, who's in any way involved in the media, who's Asian American, is being asked to help support it. So it's kind of exhausting, but it needs that type of community support. Otherwise, literally, Hollywood would not make another one, and there would be no funding.
I think
Ho is going to be fine, because Korea supports its own artists, but America does not necessarily support, you know, Hollywood does not necessarily support Asian Americans. And The Farewell didn't get a lot of awards, right? Like everyone was very disappointed that The Farewell didn't get any Oscar nominations, like neither Awkwafina nor the woman who played Nai, the grandmother, who did a really good job. They didn't get any nominations. It didn't get a screenplay, right? It got a Golden Globe from the Hollywood Foreign Press. It got an award, but not from the American awards. It got an Independent Spirit Award. So, and when the director, Lulu Wong of The Farewell, she went through the Sundance Lab. They helped her based on an essay she had written about her own family. So it took kind of these independent methods to get that made. And then, you know, she had a lot of difficulty, because, I don't know if you've seen The Farewell, it's about a Chinese American family who are spread all over the world, from Japan to New York, and some people in China. They discover that the grandmother has cancer, and it's like 6 months to live. But in Chinese tradition, you don't tell people with cancer that they have cancer, because it makes them sad and they think it will make them die sooner. So they can't tell her, but they all want to have this reunion. Okay, so that was based on the true story. Hollywood, once they came in, they told her that she needs to have a white character. So you know how they have that wedding, one of the cousins is marrying a Japanese girl, and so that's why they decide they're all going to China so that the grandmother can be there for the wedding banquet. Well, originally, the Hollywood producers wanted that Japanese character to be a white American woman. And then everyone could then explain to her, you know, what was happening and kind of translate the culture. And Lulu Wong refused. And instead, she got Awkwafina to be the central character. And even though, you know, she says, look, she's Chinese American. This is not familiar to her either. You know, why can't a Chinese American be the American character? And that was revolutionary. That Asian American character is the American character. Now, what's really sad, I mean, we constantly have to fight. And so that's why I'm so glad that Professor Langford teaches these subjects in his classes, and he inspires you. Look, you've got two of the preeminent Asian American filmmakers coming just out of Foothill, right? You are the resistance. So think about how you guys can make this change. You got my publisher to allow me to write a sequel to Dragon Chica. You guys have power, and you can tell these stories, and you can push back against the media. One of the things I was also thinking about, what was about telling these stories and getting these stories and getting authentic stories out there. Well, anyway, I mean, you will be the change that we need to see, because it's not going to come from above.
Let me just interject, since it was Pavel that asked this wonderful question, that speaking of getting things out there, Pavel, along with Beros Macedo, founded the new literary magazine at Foothill College called Creative Release. And you are welcome, if you search it on foothill.edu, you'll find out how to submit. And I happened to notice as I opened it that the first contribution is by an Asian American student, Patricia Nguyen. So it's, so that vehicle is there for you too. And it syncs well. And I was so proud of Pavel and Beto for creating this out of thin air. They did it on student power. We just stood around and tried to get out of their way. Let's take one more question, maybe two. I know that many of you, like officially my class ends at 11:50. Maybe you may have to, you know, like I don't know how your battery is doing. I'm happy to go till noon myself. We have such great questions and a great audience. We got 77 people online right now. So as long as you, but don't let me run your battery down to zero, because I know you have other things to do. But let's take at least one more question, I guess is what I was thinking.
Okay.
Moderators, are you? I'm not following the chat, so maybe Chris.
There's a question from Celine. What do you make of the? Yeah, we have a question from Celine. Do you want to read it, Celine, or we can read it?
Yeah, I can read it.
Okay.
My question was just, what do you make of the contradiction of needing to prove or appeal, to prove yourself or appeal to the predominantly white mainstream media and academies, while still attempting to demonstrate a distinct cultural identity? I was kind of thinking about like BET and like BET Awards and how they've recognized Black artists for a long time, and you know, people were like, oh my gosh, like Lizzo or Sweetie or whoever, like whatever Black artist is like popping this summer, like has been on BET for like the past like 3 years. Do you think that sort of thing would have the same success or carry the same meaning in Asian American communities?
There have been Asian American cultural institutions that have been trying to do this forever. You know, there was, and it's really hard to push into the mainstream. So for like in the 1930s, there were movie houses in Chinatown here in San Francisco that had Chinese actors and Chinese films and Chinese cabaret shows. There was, what was it? There was just a documentary about this in which they were promoting and giving paid work to Chinese American singers and dancers and actors. And then, you know, there have been long time organizations within various Asian American communities who do promote the arts and who do we have journals and we have awards and we try to promote these things. And it just is, they call it the bamboo ceiling, right? It's just so hard to kind of push against that, what you say, like the predominantly white mainstream media and their institutions, which are what, you know, if they don't recognize it, then the larger world pretends it doesn't exist in America. So I can give you an example. I don't know if you've read No No Boy by John Okada. He was a survivor of the internment era, Japanese American internment era in World War II, and he wrote this novel about the No No Boys, and they were the Japanese Americans who, when they were given this loyalty test in the camps, and the first one was said, do you agree to renounce your loyalty to Japan? And the second one was all, you know, and the other one was like, do you agree to, I don't know, maybe serve in the American military? I can't remember the two questions now. And they answered no, because if you answered yes, you're saying it's implying that you were loyal to Japan before. How can you renounce, like their idea is like, how can I renounce a loyalty that I didn't have? This is a trick question. So they said no, and they were called the No Boys. And then they didn't realize it was a trick question. You answered no on it, then you were put into a special camp, you're in prison. Some of them were deported. It was horrible for them. So he wrote a novel about the No Boys. And it was either self-published or like it didn't get any attention in the mainstream press. He tried to write another novel. His wife was so embarrassed because it's so shameful to talk about Japanese American identity that he burned it and it was lost forever. And then he ultimately committed suicide. And then there was an Asian American scholar in the 60s and the 70s who found in a used bookstore his like self-published copy of No Boy. And they're like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is one of the first voices of a Japanese American from the internment era actually writing from a Japanese American point of view. And there was like Sean Wong and these other people, and they published it. And it's been in press ever since the 70s from the University of Washington Press, right? And this is a classic of Asian American literature, No Boy. Well, very recently, because, John Okada is dead, he committed suicide, a mainstream, I think it was Penguin Classics, tried to take that book and republish it in a commercial mainstream format, but they were not going to give any money to the family, right? And they're going to commercialize it and make it, mainstream, but they're taking it from the small press, the university press that has kept it alive for now, 2 generations. So then so sometimes seeking, and so anyway, there's pushback on it. And so the small press got it back and arrested and under control because every Asian American academic was writing about this and writing protests about it and setting, protest letters about it. So sometimes there's always still this tension, right? Within the community, there's voices and there's awards. Like I got the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature. That is a branch of the American Librarian Association made up of Asian American librarians, and they pick Asian American books and literature that they want to give an award to, separate from the ALA, the mainstream, predominantly white American Librarian Association awards. And I'm very proud that Tiger Girl won that award. But it doesn't necessarily get as much attention as the one from the predominantly white ALA awards, right? Because the mainstream media emphasizes those other awards. So there's always this tension. We have within the Asian American community, and always have had arts groups in San Francisco. There's like Kearny Street Workshop that promotes Asian American writers. Nationally, there's groups like the Asian American Librarian Association that promote Asian American writing, that are very culturally sensitive and intelligent, and we say address these issues. And sometimes what the mainstream likes, it gets more attention, but is maybe not coming from the community. So it's hard. Like there have been numerous attempts to create Asian American versions of BET, right? There was Channel APA a while back. Like nobody remembers, there's always these attempts on cable to try to create these Asian American networks. And it's hard because we're a super diverse community, right? Super diverse. There's so many different kinds of Asians. And each group has its own community concerns, right? And there's so much community work that we have to do, just sustaining, like helping families, helping the elderly, doing culturally sensitive creative work. And so then to try to bring that all together when there's still and then like Asian Americans tend to have like 2/3 of Asian Americans tend to be like first generation. And so the first generation is still trying to make it in the United States, right? There's still kind of a precarious nature to that, even and trying to adapt. And so it takes so much energy, as you probably know, within every Asian American group, just to sustain its family, its larger organizations, its communities, and then to push back against the mainstream media is just that much, it just takes that much more energy. So we keep every like generation hopes that we're at a tipping point, because there was, The Farewell and Crazy Rich Asians, and there are starting to be more shows on Netflix. There was just something called Tiger Tail, which I didn't see. Ali Wong has been, having her successes. Mindy Kaling is out there, right? She had a show on, I think it was either Amazon or Hulu, and everyone is like hoping we're at this tipping point, but it's hard to say. It's so hard to say if we're finally.
Let me interject, Mei-Li, and partly because we're going to start winding down here pretty soon, and to be continued, I think, offline if we would like to, but or at
Henry
least
has one last question.
So, but let me put in an interjection just before you do that, Chris, which is that 2 of our upcoming authors in this series, in API Heritage Month series, 2 of the upcoming authors, for those of you in my class, which includes Chris and Jobin, are founders of something called New American Media, which was a breakthrough collaboration between radio broadcasters and journalists of color. And they broke the glass ceiling for everyone in radio. When radio was white dominated to the core, including National Public Radio, and this is, so Sandeep Roy, who's our next guest in my class on Thursday, 10 to noon, please join us. And he'll be coming to us, by the way, live from Kolkata. And then on April 30th, the 45th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, we'll be hosting Andrew Lamb. And though they were two of the primary founders of something called American New Media, which unfortunately has not survived the last couple, it just closed down. But they changed the face, literally the face of American radio. They changed the voice of American radio, such that now there is a generation and a pathway for your generation to put their voices out there on mainstream radio. And now it's kind of your turn now too, right? Like that's what they did. What you gonna do is what I would like to know. And now I can stop and let's have, we have 5 more minutes, so let's do one more question.
Okay, so Henry has a question.
Hi, Winberg Chai. Awesome. Can you guys hear me? Hi. It's been really inspiring hearing your thoughts today. Throughout the last year or so, I've been working on blogging, podcasting, and videos, and really just wrapping my head around that. But a lot of the same reasons that you mentioned here today on why that's so important and so crucial to this new generation of students. My question for you is, if you're able to share some of your writing processes and perhaps principles behind what really goes into drafting and generating ideas and getting those stories down.
Okay, great. Since I teach creative writing, some people will tell you you need to write every day, but I know that's really hard when you're a student and you have to do homework every day. And you have to do, work, right? So what I would say is try to keep a place designated just for your ideas, right? Because you may not have time to develop it immediately, but that idea journal is something you can go back to 10 years from now. And, and also take notes, interview your family. It may seem weird, but say, hey, grandma, can I interview you? Teach them Zoom or call them up in this time. And you might be surprised. They might like this. Just let them talk and tell you things and write it down. You may not have an idea of what to do with it right now, but you will be so glad you have that information later. I interviewed both of my grandmothers. And I didn't know I didn't know when they were going to die, but I just wanted to talk to them. And even though what I did with it immediately, like in high school, I wrote like some paper, was not ultimately that maybe creative or that interesting, I could draw upon that. And just thinking about how they talked was also important. So you can start doing these interviews now. You can start keeping your designated notebook of ideas or designated file of ideas, and it's great that you're doing the blogging because that's actually building your social media profile. And those connections you make, that's helping you find an audience, and that's helping you find these connections. Social media is so important, more than ever, for Asian Americans. If not for example, Asian Americans on Twitter, I don't think we would be having this national conversation about anti-Asian violence, right? Because certainly the mainstream media was not paying attention. And it really took a lot of Asian Americans all over the country just documenting it and speaking up. And, Russell Jung at San Francisco State has kept an archive. And he is like, if you see any incident, you witness it or you experience it, you can send it to them and they are keeping an archive. We have to do this ourselves. There's not going to be a savior who comes in and does it for us. So things like, I'm so glad that you're already so active in doing these things. You may think it's like, oh, it's not, it's small, it's huge, because all of this is it's your ideas journal, it's your experience. You're going to build on this for the rest of your life. So, I hope that that's helpful.
Yes.
Okay, and Meili, let me ask if you want to continue. As you know, if we were doing this in a real room, in the Hearthside room is where we would be doing it at Foothill College, students will often linger afterward for questions. And I'm going to just kind of leave it up to you because I don't know what your schedule is. If you'd like to stay, we still have 81 people in this room. And I'm endlessly chatty and fascinated by the conversation, but I want to be mindful of your time. And I certainly want to say to students, if your requirement to be here is now over, but your freedom to be here is not. So Meili, how are you feeling about that? Do you want to wrap up or what do you want to do?
Another 15 minutes could be fine. Sure.
Okay, okay. And right now it is straight up 11:58, and I'll even mention that 2 of these messages on my phone are from our president. President Tui is what we like to call her, President Nguyen, and she'll be on tomorrow at noon, Wednesday, specifically to talk about anti-Asian racism and her views on how to push back against that as someone who was herself an immigrant and now one of the most successful Asian American leaders in the United States as president of Foothill College. So a little advertisement there. Back to Mei Li, or maybe back to questions from Chris or Joubin. I'm not sure Joubin is still on. I can't see the whole chat list right now.
I think one of the things is, for me, is I work in healthcare, and the irony of that is, I think 2 weekends ago, we had a patient who came in who pulled me aside and said, I don't want my Asian doctor to take care of me.
Whoa.
And I basically said, well, do you see those double doors over there? I'll wheel you right out. And because that's, you don't have that choice. This is what it is. This is the emergency room. So, but I want to tie into the economic power of the Asian American community. Certainly that is there, certainly in Silicon Valley and other places. And I think economic power does bring social power. And I think you look at how Netflix, and at a certain point, Amazon, those studios are doing more Asian stories, is because they're seeing personally their executives, but also their employees, and also the economic power that's between those companies. I think that's where it's played out. I think you should definitely, I think being able to use those strengths that you have, certainly in healthcare and tech and everything else, to get those voices out. If you could ask me how to do that, I don't know, but I'm just making the observation.
I've noticed that more media companies do want more diverse interns, and they're looking because they recognize, at least on the West Coast, that audiences and customers are very diverse, and they want to reach and tap that market. As Joban said, there is an economic, like maybe the social justice doesn't reach them, but the economic necessity of reaching out to diverse communities is something they're aware of. And so, young people can use that as an opportunity to say, that's why I should be hired.
Chris, you had a question.
Yeah.
Are you going to read them?
I think another question would be about lilacs. Do you think there was more of a kind of insecurity that your mother had when she was kind of retconning her story of the black woman that was featured in Lilacs? Or why do you think she did that?
At the end of her life, when she was trying to write the story, I don't know if it was insecurity so much as that she really wished that it had gone differently. She didn't know, she really didn't want, she loved her mother, but she knew her mother was racist. She couldn't say it, but she knew her mother was racist, right? And she didn't want her mother to be racist. And I think she just wanted to have a happy ending. So when she wrote the happy ending in that final version, when she wrote she died a few months later. And she wished that her parents could recognize the humanity of their black neighbors who had been so kind to my mother as a little child and who saved their whole house. And also, she didn't say this, but I feel like, had my grandmother made friends with that woman and her husband, it might have helped her, because my grandfather was an alcoholic, and in those days he was very violent, and he was beating my grandmother, and she had no one who would help her. No one who would help her. And if she'd had an ally, maybe she could have gotten out of that abusive situation. But it didn't happen, right? My grandmother had been taught, as a woman born in 1913, to keep the color line where it was and not to cross it, and to beat your child and to make sure they don't cross it. That's, what she had been raised to be. So my mother writing that happy ending in which her mother could recognize the humanity and the kindness of the black neighbor was my mother's dream. She didn't see it in her life. She wrote it in her story because that's what she'd wanted. So I think the very fact that my mother could tell me this story when I was a little child, you know, I don't think sometimes my mother knew why she was telling her stories, but she would tell, I think it showed that she knew that it was wrong and that she wished the world were different. But again, like that generation was not given tools. They didn't know how to be anti-racist. They didn't know what to do. She was silent generation. That generation was told to shut up and put up. So.
Jamie has a question.
So my question just talks about higher education, and basically you mentioned going to China in graduate school and studying there, and that helped you write your stories as well. And I wanted to ask if you think that higher education is a guaranteed route to being an established writer. And after studying various writers, like in my English 1 week class, we read The Namesake, and Juhunpa Lahiri went to so many schools and so many institutions. And I'm super willing to be a journalist and a writer and know that, or a teacher, and know that like financially it won't always help, but going to school is so expensive, especially in this country. So I just wanted to ask, like, is higher education like really helpful within your publishing and just growing as a writer as well?
Realistically, it is. It is. I mean, you're making a smart decision now because you're at Foothill, right? So that's like a really, you get an excellent, excellent education. I know your teachers. I know Professor Langford. Like, you know, he has a PhD from Stanford. Your professors are all really well educated. That's the most important thing. It's not the price tag of the school. It's the education and accomplishments of your professors. Because then that's what, these are the people who are going to be teaching you. So there's no guaranteed path, but I know that in my own life, I needed an education. And I tried to get the best education that I could get because that was going to help me. I could tell. Like, I went to like the rural school I went to in South Dakota was horrible. It was horrible. I mean, I had teachers who, like, their grammar was poor. They, you know, they were teaching us false things, and I would argue with them. It was a nightmare. You know, as a society, America does not value public education the way it should. I'm hoping, because we have been doing this, students taking out loans and getting horribly in debt for a generation now, and that has been a disaster for our nation, right? I'm hoping because, you know, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have been really pushing this to forgive the student loan debt, but also to make college free again. It used to be, and for my mother's generation in the 1978 in California, you could go to a UC, there was no tuition, you paid fees. Right? It was very affordable. It was very affordable. People used to be able, you'd have a summer job, and then you could use that summer job salary to pay for a year of school. A year of school. So it's possible. We used to have this. I mean, my generation, it was starting to get more expensive and more expensive. I worked, you know, 35 hours a week, every week, the whole time I was in college. And then I had to get a paying job every single break just to pay for college. And I had scholarships, right? But I still needed that. And in grad school, I went to a lot of different schools because I would go wherever, and I would move wherever I got the most financial aid, because I couldn't just stay where I necessarily wanted to be. I went to where I could afford to get my education. And I still think that's the wise thing to do. I'm hoping that we as a nation will wake up and stop making college so expensive. I think we're gonna see, we're at a turning point. We'll see if that happens. But in the meantime, I think it's great you're going to Foothill. It's affordable still, and you have excellent professors. And I think that looking for where you can study what you want to study with really well-educated professors who are active in their fields, that's very important, whether you want to be a journalist or any type of writer. And getting as much knowledge as you can, it will be very useful for you as a writer. So, I mean, not just doing school things, but also like using the opportunities of your school to get internships. And like, you know, Professor Langford has talked about a number of student publications. Do those publications. Send out your work, get those clips. I'm serious. That's how I got my internships when I was in college. I got clips. I wrote for the school paper. I submitted work to the literary journal. I was constantly doing these things on top of my other work. I also washed pots and pans, but they don't, you know, it's okay. You do what you do to make money, but then also do the literary stuff Get those internships. If you can get an editorship at those journals, do it, because seriously, the people who hire you or give you internships, they will look on your CV for that type of stuff. And schools have these types of opportunities, so they're useful.
If I can interject, sometimes we don't give enough honor to the CSUs right in our own backyard, even though people are coming from all over the world. And I hope this interaction with Professor Chai helps you understand that for decades, the creative writing program and film program, other programs, ethnic studies programs at San Francisco State, queer studies programs have led the world and the nation literally in punching through these glass ceilings and allowing people to have a voice. And San Francisco State has one of the proudest traditions. I mean, like any institution like Foothill, it has its problems. Maylia can tell you all about them. Nevertheless, there's no institution on the face of the planet that's done more to get the voices of writers of color, filmmakers of color, scholars of color out there than San Francisco State. I think that's just flat out true. And San Jose State right up there with them, right? I have so many colleagues that I'm so proud of.
I'll just mention that, like, San Francisco State is part of the CSU. We're still one of the most affordable colleges in the entire United States. You know, so we do have students who are working full time, but they can pay for it. They can pay for their education. And I think affordability is important. And we have great professors. And like our MFA program, it's, I think it's like roughly $8,000 for the full year per year, which maybe seems like a lot, but actually, you know, if you go down to like UCLA's MFA program in screenwriting, that's, well, even 10 years ago it was $40,000, right? You know, if you're going to like Columbia, it's $50,000. So if you can get this for $8,000 a year, it's just as good. And I will say it's just as good in education, you know, and you don't need to go into that level of horrific debt to get a good education. Pay attention to where the professors, what they're doing in their fields, and, you know, make sure that they're well educated, but, you know, you can get a good education.
Let's do one more question and then give Meili another chance to have a life and a job, since she does have this other job as being a professor and, well, actually 3, professor, journalist, and fiction writer, and so forth. So one more question. Co-host, please.
Henry, go ahead.
Henry, yeah.
Hi, Meili. Besides
Hi.
consistent reading and writing, may you share the most valuable resource you could have to strengthen your reading and writing skills?
You know, I would say it's an internship. I did an internship almost, I think, every year that I was in college. And it's useful because it's outside of school. It's a workplace experience. I made contacts, which helped me get jobs later, which I needed. It forced me to do writing other than like what I would ordinarily do. You meet all kinds of different people. Sometimes, I mean, I will not lie, some of them can be very unpleasant. You are the lowest person in the office. And so people, you know, you get treated like the newbie and the student and, all of that. But I learned really valuable stuff at every internship I did. I did a copy editing internship at Kansas City, Missouri for the Kansas City Star newspaper. And it was so difficult. I had to get up like at 6 o'clock in the morning because it's a morning paper. And it's like you're working on such tense deadlines, and man, the bosses there, they'd yell at us. It was horrible. But I learned that skill, right? And then I had that networking, and then I learned about a different part of the country. I mean, I did internships, like I did an internship with the Associated Press, which ultimately allowed me to get a paid job a full-time job with the Associated Press. And, even like if you want to be a reporter, don't be afraid to take the copy editing job. The job adjacent to your dream job is still a path towards that dream job. It can be very hard to get the dream job on the first try. I wrote about things like I never thought I would write about when I was in college. The first position I could get with our college newspaper was covering sports. Like, I don't watch sports. I mean, I had to write about a tennis match, and I was like, I couldn't tell which side was which. They're all wearing white. But I did that because that was my path in to start getting publications with the school newspaper. So I'd say the most valuable thing is, after like your own practice of reading and writing, is to try to get an internship in the field that you hope to get into.
And let me once again do a little ad. Due to the advocacy and the eloquence of Foothill students, we once again do have a school newspaper. And please write for it. We are still fighting to get a full-time journalism professor, but we do have classes in journalism. We do have a newspaper, and please sign up, because that's a way you can get that experience right on campus. You can also help out with a number of offices at Foothill College to do internships with them and offer your writing skills. Our Office of Public Relations and Marketing, by the way, I didn't thank Julie Ceballos, who was instrumental in getting our website up for API Heritage Month. I didn't thank Erin Clifford Ortiz, who is our student, is one of our student services staff, who is courageous and endlessly energetic in forming these Heritage Months, which are a huge amount of work backstage. But all the Heritage Months need writers. ASFC needs writers. The clubs should be writing. We need to write for our Creative Release magazine. We need to write for our own student newspaper that only exists because you all fought for it. For 25 years of my Foothill career, we had no student newspaper because the college shut it down. And the reason we have one again is because you all fought for it and funded it with your own student fees. And now the college has kind of woken up and said, okay, we'll do that. And now, but we can't keep it going if you don't write. Meili, are you ready for more questions? I told you I would let you go at 12:15. How are you feeling about this? I want to mention, just to brag about you, that we're at the highest level of participation in this room now of the whole more than 2 hours and 15 minutes. So I think it is a testament to your eloquence and your passion, which I have experienced in person and in writing for many years. And I'm so glad we've been able to share it. But I'm leaving it up to you if you want to take more questions.
I'd be happy to take, I can take one more question. How about that? One more question, and then I'll let people go and then get their lunch and start thinking about writing and applying to things and put this into practice.
Okay, and Chris, do we have a student that hasn't had a chance yet that you could identify as still online and ready to go?
So far, it looks like all the questions have been answered so far.
Does anybody want to raise your hand if you know how to do that with your little icon? And if not, maybe some of the pre-existing questioners can come in, or Jobin or Chris. That would be fine.
Like, what do you think would be kind of the, what should we take out of this discussion that we've had with you in your presentation? What should we leave with and kind of implement throughout our lives?
My hope is that you would feel empowered, that you would feel that your voice and your perspective is important and necessary for the safe functioning of the United States, and the world in general. And that I would hope that you would also feel inspired and empowered to believe that you can do it. Like, if you can dream it, you can do it. And if, specifically, if you want to work in the arts, or if you want to write, you want to get those type of stories told, you may feel, it may feel distant from, being a teenager in a class. I was once that teenager in a class. If I can be on a farm in South Dakota with people shooting at my house and thinking I don't have a right to exist, and my mother telling me, take your glasses off so you look pretty, and then I'm blind. I mean, if I can go from there to here, and I can tell the stories that I want to tell in the form that I want to tell them, because when I didn't even know how to do that when I first started, right? If I can do that, you can do that. There's a way. And so if you dream it, dare to dream, and then just follow, get good classes, get a good education, get those interns, get those clips. Believe me, everyone started somewhere. They started where you are. You can do it. And I just also want to encourage you to do it, because it was horrifying when 2016 rolled around, because it felt like we were really sliding backwards. And it really reminded me, just rhetorically, and the ugliness of the language and the stupidity of exactly what I grew up with. And I'm like, oh my God, here we are again. And like, people have been talking about how the COVID crisis reminds them of the AIDS crisis. Well, I lived through that AIDS crisis, and I remember the stigma and the stupidity and like people not taking it seriously. At least we're a little bit faster to take it seriously this time. But I don't want us to slide back to that, right? It was hard work for a generation and a half to get out of that kind of like era of just open bigotry and open hatred. And I don't want us to slide back as a nation. And I feel we're at this tipping point. And so like your voices know they are important, and they make our world a better, safer place for all of us. So have that confidence. I'm encouraging you, I'm telling you to have that confidence, and you can do it. I have absolute faith, you can do it.
All right, and with that, maybe we can do hand claps, or there is an icon. Thank you so much, Professor Chai. And it was such an honor to have you here. And like I said, like, boy, did we hold the audience. It just kept growing and growing and growing. And I want to emphasize that what you said at the end there really touched me. Thank you for referencing the AIDS generation as a gay man who lived through that, whose professors died, including some of the professors that had broken the glass ceiling to be not only the first out professors, but in one case, the first Latinx professor at Stanford. I lost him as a mentor. But from my generation to yours, the last great plague, the great slogan of that time still applies: silence equals death. Yeah. Silence equals death. And it's often an emotional death. Like in the midst of a plague, it can be actual death, right? And if you're attacked, it can be actual death. But there's another kind of death that's worth facing the fear for. And I did give my students a little speech as the welcome message for this class that's been your anchor audience, Mei Li, that you journalists like doctors, journalists like firefighters, journalists run toward the danger and tell the truth. And there are journalists all around the world that literally risk their lives every single day to tell the story of their community and their people and their nation, literally risk their lives. So you've got to take some risks to get the stories out there. And there's no better teacher of that than Mei Li Chai. So Mei Li, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll have you back. I want to also end just by saying once again, tomorrow is the anti-racism discussion with President Win at noon. Sandeep Roy is coming on Thursday at 10 o'clock to continue this conversation from Kolkata. We have a whole lineup of speakers. I'll put in one more plug since it's so special to me that Andrew Lam, one of Foothill's favorite speakers, is joining us live from Saigon on the 45th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, as we call it here in the States. And so I would love to see some of you who have joined us from outside returning. And I'd also like to end by pointing you to the resource page that Foothill College has provided you. You go to foothill.edu, you search for API Heritage Month, and on the right side of the screen, you'll find library resources that Laura Gamazar, amazing equity librarian, has put together a whole list of resources. Of course, you can go to Mei Li Chai's own author page, and you can look her up on Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, a number of other sources, and search her through San Francisco State. So continue the conversation with us all this month, and thank you so much to my students and others who have joined us. And I'm going to stop the recording and end the meeting at this point.
If we can contact you, how should we contact you if we have any more questions, Professor Chai?
Email me. Easy email is chai@sfsu.edu. chai@sfsu.edu. I'd be happy to hear from you. Professor Langford always has great students. I always enjoy so much talking with everyone at Foothill College. I always get very inspired by these conversations. So thank you for hosting me.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's the end of this API Heritage Month event. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, May.
Thank you, May. Thank you, students. See you on Thursday.